Welcome back to the Majestic Devlog. Over the past several months, actually since the beginning of starting this project, performance has always been at the forefront of my thought process. There's many things with this game I'm doing that would be a little crazy, I would think. The new technology that Unreal Engine 5 has to offer has allowed me to make this game, but it's not been without a lot of struggle, and it's not typically recommended to build a game using bleeding edge technology. There's a lot of growing pains, and that's been true with this game from the very beginning. I would say for the first 6 to 8 months of development, I wasn't even able to test the game, play test it at all. I was just developing things with the hopes that someday it will be playable. In those early days, it was unplayable. Frame rate, FPS, bugs, glitches, errors, warnings, everything imaginable that just did not make for a very pleasant experience. And that was in early release of Unreal 5. It wasn't the true release yet, and the technology has come a long way. And after a very long time, especially focusing on it in the last few months, I now believe at this time of recording this video that the game in its current state is playable. It's at a point where I believe I can focus on the content. Very soon I will just be adding content to the game with the comfort of knowing it is playable. So all that said, how did it get to this point? What were the tricks and tips and everything to get this game playable? I'm going to go through a big list of items that all helped in their own way. Hopefully this video will help others out there with optimizing their game, and if you see anything I can do better, please let me know. This video will be a little longer than my previous devlogs. I will try to explain things a little better. I'm also just showing a greater number of things in this video. A lot of this is focused on an open world game with a large world, a huge environment. So to start, here is a trace I did back several months ago. This is a profiling tool built into Unreal Engine. I recorded this in Unreal Engine 5.1. If you look here, once the game was steady, it's basically hovering at, I would say, 25 FPS range, with spikes where it is much lower than that. It was struggling to get to 30 FPS, again, several months ago. So the profiling tool is clearly an important tool. I am not an expert at analyzing the profiling tool, but when looking through this, a couple things did stand out to me. I've been seeing grass and Niagara come up in quite a few places. So one of the first areas I focused on was the grass. I wanted thick, lush grass in my game, but you can't always get what you want. It was just, it seemed to be slowing the game down quite a bit. So here is my grass setup, and I basically am feathering it the further it gets away from the character. So I basically have grass duplicated a couple times, and I have it set up where they cull at different distances, and the farther away from the character it is, the density of that grass will be less. The grass may get tweaked more and more in the future to try to get it thicker and lusher, but for now I wanted the performance to be better. So another thing with the grass and flowers and trees, foliage, bushes, when you're using Nanite, I have it aggressively set to not use world position offset when the camera is at a certain distance. So here, these pink flowers, the world position offset is disabled right now. It looks like 20 meters, and you can see as I pull back the camera, they stop waving in the wind. World position offset on Nanite meshes is pretty significant performance hit, so you want to cull those out, disable it to whatever makes the most sense. Looking at the Nanite view of the level, the entire level is Nanite. Every single thing in the level is using Nanite, even the landscape. So with the Nanite landscape, it takes advantage of virtual texturing and virtual shadow maps. You can see the virtual shadow map, almost everything is green except where the sun is casting shadows from the trees. That is still a performance hit where the blue is, and that is something to be addressed in the future. So here is the landscape, and it is set up with virtual texturing. In Unreal 5.2, you cannot have a textured Nanite landscape without using virtual texturing, but it's also a performance gain. So this level in the outliner has about 50,000 actors. Normally that would be a lot of draw calls. With Nanite, you can see I am at 150, 200, in some cases less than 100 draw calls, and that's all really managed by using Nanite for everything. The lights, it says there's 13 lights. In reality, there's like one directional light for my entire game. I'm using Ultra Dynamic Sky for my sky, and I'm using the one directional light that comes with that for the sun. And then I do have some point lights in the level which have small radiuses for performance reasons. Very minimal on lights. I have disabled shadows on things that don't need it. However, I do have shadows enabled for trees because it just looks much better. It's a pretty big performance hit, but shadows on trees is one of those things that makes the level look a lot better. One thing to point out on the right side is the stat unit, which is displaying frame times for rendering and the game thread. And one thing to figure out when trying to improve performance is if you are CPU bound or GPU bound. This game has mostly been CPU bound. You can see here that the entire frame takes about 30 milliseconds, and 20 of that is the game thread, which is your CPU. Now, there are a couple of stipulations with that. This is in the editor, and it has all the editor tasks on the back end taking up CPU time. The best thing to do is to build the game and then run the profiling tool from a built version of the game. At least in my experience, that's worked best. However, I do know the game has mostly been CPU bound, but there's been a lot of work put towards improving the game thread. One major area that I had to focus on was the collisions for a lot of assets. So when I first built my world, I was really not paying attention to collisions. I just wanted things to work immediately, and I was doing things quickly and roughing things in. I never really spent the time to set up the collisions properly, and what ended up happening is I did some things like turning on complex collision for a lot of assets. This was a very bad mistake, and when you do that, the CPU just wants to melt. What I ended up doing is going through all my assets and turning off complex collisions, making sure they were using simple collisions. Right now I kind of roughed in the simple collisions using the built-in engine tools. I will need to go back and probably tweak a lot of them. Where the simple collisions do not follow the topology, the character does fall inside the mesh as it's walking around on top of the geometry. So that was a huge win. That right there, I don't have an exact number, but it definitely improved performance quite significantly. Another thing is my game's using the world partition system, and my 50,000 actors in the level are all streaming in and out as the character moves around the level automatically, and this is all done by the engine pretty seamlessly. There's not really too much to do there, and the fact it's all Nanite, I am not building HLODs or anything like that. Moving on to how I've designed my game, I have a lot of managers that kind of handle various things. For example, I have a building manager, which basically handles the lights turning on and off of buildings. I have an essence manager, which spawns essence in the sky nearby the character. I have an effects manager, which spawns effects around your camera. I do not hand place the particle effects. I am dynamically spawning them. These are like butterflies and daffodils floating in the wind and leaves and dust. So I have all these managers spawning and despawning assets continuously, and all of these are on timers. So I had a couple optimizations here that were pretty big. The first one was pooling all of the spawned assets. So in this wildlife manager, it's basically every type of wildlife I spawn into the level: chickens, cows, deer, fox, bears, goats, etc. This is one of the more in-depth examples where I have a bunch of pools for each type of animal. How this is set up is each pool basically starts with one unit, one chicken, one cow, etc. But if I need to spawn like 5 deer, that first time it'll create 5 deer, and then from then on there will always be 5 or more in the pool. And then when those deer get recycled, they'll just bounce back to the pool and then back into the world, and I won't be creating any more unless I exceed the number that are currently in the pool. So that's a pretty nice feature with this plugin. This pool for essence, I cap it at 40 total essence in the pool, never to exceed that number, because I also have it set to never to exceed 40 in the world at any one time. 40 essence are created when the game begins, and they will just bounce back and forth from the pool to the world. And again, that's a huge performance gain. The next optimization, which came from another marketplace plugin that I was experimenting with, is this optimization proxy plugin. And what it does is you attach it to various skeletal mesh assets. For example, my people. Also, I have enemies in the game. So people, wildlife, and enemies are all skeletal mesh assets. What happens is when these are at a far enough distance from the character, the optimizer will do things to the assets to make them more performant. For example, reducing the animations or making them invisible or having them freeze entirely. I do think this helps quite a bit when there's a lot of AI in the scene. There can be quite a bit with enemies, animals, and people. So using this optimization proxy, I do believe, is a pretty big win. So those were a couple marketplace assets I'm taking advantage of. They do seem to be helping quite a bit. Another optimization, which I wasn't too sure if it would work or not, had to do again with my global timers in all these manager systems. I wasn't quite sure if having all these timers at once, if that was a drain on the performance or not. So one thing I noticed in my playtesting is every 5 to 10 seconds the game would hitch. So that was one thing I wanted to try to eliminate, and with the hitching, the only thing I could imagine is it still had to do with these managers that were spawning things into the world. Even though I was pooling the assets now, the hitching was still there. So I had an idea to condense the timers into one global timer that kind of controlled all of my managers. I was not convinced this would actually work, but I think it does. I think it works pretty well, actually, based on my latest playtest. So what I did is I set up a global timer manager, which happens to be this blueprint. I tried to keep it as lightweight as possible, very minimal instructions. I have a couple functions, one to register a timer and then to unregister a timer, and then just a few variables, and the most important being the timestamp, which is when the registered timer was last activated, basically. So this global timer manager, I have a component that is attached to my actors, my manager actors or any actor that needs a timer. Here is my actor component global timer. So this is the component that gets attached to any actor. On begin play, it's going to register with the manager. So the global timer manager just cycles through all the registered timers, which there might only be 5 to 10 of them. I'm not going to register every timer with it. It's only really timers that exist for a long time or forever. And I have it set up so each of these timers can have different durations. The timestamp variable basically determines, you compare that to the duration of the timer, and then if the duration, since the last timestamp is greater than the duration of the timer, then you call the dispatch to fire off the timer event. So here's my building manager, where I switched out the regular timer and added the component timer to it, and then just cleaned up the blueprint here a little bit to recognize that change. So I've eliminated a lot of redundant timers, and it seems like that resolved the majority of the hitching. In my last playtest, it was working pretty smoothly. Maybe these timers weren't what was causing the hitching and it was something else, but again, it seems to be working just fine, and for now I'll leave it as it is. Another area where I got a great amount of CPU performance is in Niagara, and that's with the particle scalability. I have a lot of particle effects in my game, and this took quite a long time to go through them all, but I went through every single particle effect, and in the scalability settings of every single emitter for every single particle, I went through and tweaked the culling, the maximum distance for these emitters. So here in this essence particle effect, the first emitter, the base, I have it culling after 5,000 units. That's quite close actually, because that is the small pink particles flying around where the character really doesn't need to see them at a long distance. And then the fire emitter, which is the blue fire, this one's the top portion of the flame. The top portion is being culled after 80,000 units, and the bottom portion of the fire is being culled after 50,000 units. So I basically, the farther you are away, if you're very far away, you'll only see one emitter, the top part of the flame. As you get a little closer, you'll see the whole flame, and as you're super close, you'll see the little pink particles. By adjusting these culling numbers for every single effect based on the needs of the game, I was able to gain a significant amount of performance on the CPU. Because this is a giant open world game, it's basically unfeasible to have a navigational mesh. It would be a huge memory draw. So there's no navigational mesh in my game. What I'm doing is using navigation invokers on my AI, where the navigation is just being generated in real time. The invokers do cause a performance hit, but it's offset by the hit that a giant navigation mesh would create. It's a trade-off and determined by how large your game world is. In my game, I'm using a plugin, Ultra Dynamic Sky. Ultra Dynamic Sky is a very commonly used plugin. It's a very, very good plugin, has a lot of support behind it. Ultra Dynamic Sky is a huge system with a lot of variables, and you can go overboard with it. One optimization I did is, because it's a flying game, I really wanted the volumetric clouds so that you can fly through them. I did have 2 layers of clouds enabled. It looked better, but it's more performant to have a single layer, so I did disable the double layer of clouds. I went through the documentation for the sky asset and followed a few other tips and tricks for optimization. It's definitely an area that can certainly hurt performance if not paid close attention to. Another big gain is tick events in actors. I do find that even if the actor does not have anything plugged into their tick event, you will gain some performance by disabling the tick event entirely in the details panel. If it's not needed, I've disabled it. My character is one actor that does use tick events. I only have 4 actors in the game that actually use the tick event. The character is one of them to handle movement and other things that you want to be smooth. But the components on my character, the tick event is disabled. I've disabled it everywhere I don't need it, and every other asset that doesn't need it. So the only assets that have tick enabled would be the character, the sky asset for the time of day, although I've slowed down the tick event with the sky, and the player controller requires it. It just doesn't work properly, even though I'm not using the event tick. Every other asset and actor I have in the game has tick disabled. Another optimization for memory management has to do with casting, interfaces, dispatches. So I basically tried to remove casting from as much of my workflow as possible. How I've done that is with heavy use of interfaces. Here I have 18 different blueprint interfaces. This basically takes place of casting. I actually like interfaces quite a bit. It makes things so much easier. When you get an actor reference, you don't have to worry about casting at all, which helps memory management. You just call the interface, and if the interface is on that actor, it will trigger the interface event. Now, I may have gone a little overboard with the interfaces. It's just one of those things where when I run across something, I'm like, oh, let me make an interface for that. And I don't really think, should I make it a different way with dispatches or something. But I've been going back and refactoring some code and making things more performant as time goes on. I'm usually not trying to think of the most optimized way originally. I just want to try to get something to work. One thing with my game mode is I'm casting quite a bit in the game mode. I want to get references to the player controller and the game instance. Since the game mode is loaded with these other assets anyway, then casting to them is not that big of a deal since they'll already be in memory. However, you can see my player controller has 0 casts. If I'm using the player controller at the main menu screen, I'm not going to be loading in like character assets or random game mode stuff. So it'll be pretty lightweight at the main menu screen and elsewhere. My game instance right now is casting to the player controller, which, since the player controller is fairly lightweight, that's not that big of a deal. However, I will be eliminating this cast anyway. It's kind of a temporary thing. Since the game instance is the first thing loaded when you start your game, it'll be super lightweight, which improves load time into the game. Another big area with memory has to do with textures. I have a lot of textures that came over as 8K, and if these are normal maps or roughness maps, it does not make sense to have an 8K. In fact, I don't want anything above 4K, so all the 8K textures I have a maximum resolution size of 4K or less. If it's a normal map, then I'm making it a 2K texture. If it's roughness, I believe I might be going to a 1K. Another performance enhancement for load times is I went through this help file and just follow the instructions here for ordering your pack file. This will help load times quite significantly. It takes about 12 to 13 seconds for my game to load, which is a significant performance increase from where it began. I believe it used to take maybe 30 seconds. So every little thing has helped, and it definitely loads a lot quicker now. So it basically logs every single asset that gets loaded and numbers it. At the end of each line is a number, meaning the order it was loaded in. and after I got to asset number 2069, I basically stopped playing the game. I will need to do this more in the future and replay the game and redo this ordering. So here in this playtest, and I'll have another one at the end of this video, this is the one before my timer changes and some other optimizations, and there is a small hitch every 5 to 10 seconds where the FPS will drop to like maybe 5 to 15. So that was quite frustrating and annoying, but I'll have another playtest which is more recent, and I believe it's looking pretty good. From when we started this video, I showed the profiling tool had the average FPS, I was saying between 20 to 30. Other than the small hitching that happens, it's really maintaining a 40 to 50 plus FPS range, which is, I would say, fantastic. Some future optimizations I'm working on. One of them is DLSS 3 by NVIDIA, fully enabling that plugin. I need to enable some settings so the player has some customization over it. Also, I do not have a 40 series graphics card, so I cannot take advantage of the frame generation, which is unfortunate. But if someone out there does have a 40 series graphics card, that frame generation is supposed to like double their FPS. So hopefully that's the case, and that's a nice win for those players. Here I just found out the animation compression library, it's finally supports Unreal 5.2. In the future playtest, I will have compressed all of my animations, which there are about 400 of them. Another optimization for the future, and maybe somebody can help me with this one. I have chaos physics in a couple spots, and I'd like to use it more, but I've just been running into roadblock after roadblock with chaos. Doing real-time physics is just out of the question. It's way too performance heavy, at least from my experience, or I just don't have the time to make it work. So what I wanted to do is to cache the physics and use the cache, which would be super nice and perform it. And you can see here I have that working in a sequence, and my tower is crumbling and it looks beautiful. However, this Chaos Cache Manager seems to be an experimental feature, and when I build the game, it does not work. It basically skips to the end of the destruction or the cache and just shows, you know, the final result. It doesn't show this beautiful cascading destruction in the built version of the game, unfortunately. Right now I just kind of put a pause on anything physics related. I'm not quite sure what the problem is. Looking at future releases and what can help performance, it looks like in 5.3 virtual shadow maps will now be production ready. Level streaming persistence is actually a big thing, because I have some actors in my game that are just always existing because I don't want to have to deal with the persistence of them. So if this level streaming persistence is something that ends up working, then perhaps I can stream in those actors and gain a little bit of performance there. Nanite Landscape, I'm already using Nanite Landscape. It does exist in 5.2, but there are some roadblocks in place, and I'm not sure if it'll be more performant or just kind of the same and easier to use, but that's something to hope for in the future as well. Here is the latest playtest of the game, and I mean, it's I think running super smooth. The hitching seems to be gone. There might be one here or there randomly, but I'm traveling super fast through the level and really not experiencing a hitch whatsoever. It feels smooth, it feels nice to play. It's over 30 FPS, not quite 60. I'd say it's probably averaging about 45 on a 3090, and on the 3090 here I do have graphics set to epic. I have it at 4K resolution. So settings can be tweaked for lower end graphics cards. I do have a 1070 that I also test on, and in past tests this might sound weird, but the 1070 was actually performing better than the 3090 simply because it's a 1080p graphics card. It can't even handle 4K, so the resolution's smaller by default, and it was just running much better. So I don't expect it to be too big of an issue going to lower end graphics cards. As long as the graphics card supports Nanite, then it should be pretty good. So those are a lot of the steps and things I've done to get to this point, and I wanted to make this video now before I started forgetting everything. It was a lot to cover, and I actually think I'll come back to this myself and review what I did to get to this point, because there's quite a lot that goes into performance, a lot of little knobs and buttons that need to be adjusted here and there to really eke out all the little bits of performance that are needed for a game like this. So that's going to be it for this one. Thank you for watching. Leave me a comment. I like to hear what you guys say. Maybe you can solve some of my problems that I brought up throughout this video. Please subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care.